This is Note Taker 31, Food Webs and Energy Pyramids. This note taker may seem long, being 3 pages. However, there are a lot of terms, a lot of vocabulary in this note taker that you are going to need for the remainder of the year. Now, on this note taker, we're going to discuss the one of the probably most important interactions among living things. And this is going to be how energy flows through our ecosystem. Now, in an ecosystem, a living thing or an organism is going to fall into one of 3 categories. It's going to either be a producer, a consumer, or a decomposer. And what determines which group the organism falls into is how an organism obtains energy and how it interacts with other organisms in the community. So we're going to look at each of these terms individually. To produce means to make. So our producers are going to make their own food. They're actually going to use a source of energy, which is sunlight, and they're going to also use water and carbon dioxide, and they're going to turn those things into a food source, which is going to be glucose. Now, this process should sound familiar to you because we covered it in the first 9 weeks, and we've talked about it throughout the year. This is photosynthesis. So another name for our producers is an autotroph. And if you look on the word wall in the classroom, auto means self, trophos means feeder. So self-feeder means it makes its own food source. So with our producers, if you can think about things that we have talked about throughout the year that do photosynthesis, these are going to be your producers. So all of our plants are going to be producers, but also your plant-like protists that we've talked about third 9 weeks. They will also fall into this category of producers. Now, not all organisms in the environment can make their own food using photosynthesis. There are some organisms that actually have to find food, and they're going to either get the sun's energy by directly eating a producer, or they can get it by eating another animal that ate a plant. So we can have different levels. These organisms are going to be called consumers. To consume means to eat. So we are consumers because we have to eat to get our energy. Another name for a consumer is a word we've talked about already this year, and that would be heterotroph. Hetero means different, trophos means feeder. So this is a living thing that must go to a different source to get their energy. And we have lots of different types of consumers. The first group of consumers would be your herbivores. Herbivores are going to eat only plant material. Examples would be grasshoppers and rabbits, cows, antelopes, zebras. All of these are going to be example of herbivores. And again, a lot of them are going to be your grazing animals like your cow, your antelopes, your zebra, your elephant, your giraffe, things you see kind of grazing in a field. The next group of consumers are going to be your carnivores. These are going to eat other animals. So we can have something as small as a spider that eats other insects. That's why it's a carnivore. I have here in the picture eagles, leopards, snakes, wolves. All these are examples of carnivores. They're going to be, again, your meat eaters. Your omnivores are going to eat both plant and animal material. So some examples of your omnivores: bears, crows, pigs, and us. We are actually born as omnivores, which means our body needs nutrients from both plant and animal material. Now, I do know that some people choose to be vegetarians. They choose to eat a diet rich in your plant materials, and they avoid the meats. Now, that does not make you an herbivore, because your vegetarians were born omnivores. They need to take supplements or make sure they're eating other foods to get some of the nutrients that they would normally get from meat. Your last group of consumers are going to be your scavengers. And your scavengers are going to sound at first like decomposers when we talked about those. However, they are not. Your scavenger is a consumer that gets its energy by feeding off of a dead animal. These are like your couch potatoes of the animal kingdom. They don't want to use the energy to go kill the food themselves. So they wait till something else kills the food or the food dies on its own, and then they go feed off of that dead body. So examples of your scavengers: in the top you have your hyena and vulture, and on the bottom you have an animal called a jackal, and then you also have a hagfish. All of these animals would rather somebody else kill their food, and then they sneak in afterwards to take it. Also, with our consumers, you are going to have to know levels of consumers. And most of the food chains, and you'll see that at the bottom of the slide, this is a food chain. This is something that you should remember from elementary school. But as we look at this, when we talk about consumers, we're going to have most of our food chains we're going to look at in class are going to have anywhere from 1, 2, or 3 animals in it. So each of these animals are a certain level of consumer. So in the picture, you will notice that the bunny rabbit has a number on it, the snake has a number on it, and the hawk has a number on it. That's because these are your 3 consumers. The grass doesn't get a number because it's a producer, not a consumer. The mushrooms do not have a number because they are a decomposer, not a consumer. So when we're counting consumers in a food chain, the very first animal in the food chain, which is going to be something that eats the plant, that's going to be your primary or first level consumer. Your second level or secondary consumer is going to be an animal that eats the animal that eats the plant. So it's going to be your second animal in the line. Your third level or tertiary consumer eats the animal that ate the animal that ate the grass. So it'll be the third animal in line. Now, we don't have to stop at the third level. If you have a food chain that has 8 or 9 animals in it all in a row, then that means you're going to have 8 or 9 levels of consumers. Each time you go to the next animal, you go up 1 level. Now, I want to take a minute to look at this food chain below. And we're going to talk about food chains again a little later on the notes, but I wanted to show you a couple of things. There is a producer, which is a plant. There is at least 1 consumer, which is the animal. And you will also see that it has a decomposer at the end. You will also notice that the arrows point to the animal doing the eating. So this arrow is going to represent the direction the energy is moving in. So with the grass gives energy to the bunny when the bunny eats it. A good way to remember is the arrow always points to the thing doing the eating. If you can remember, get in my belly, that's where the arrow's pointing, is to the belly of the next thing in line. The last group, which I mentioned already on the last slide, are our decomposers. Your decomposers are unlike your scavengers. Your decomposers are lots of living things, whether it's a bacteria, a fungus. There are even some animals that act as decomposers. But their job is to take dead stuff, plants and animal, and it's going to break it down into simpler substances, and it's going to take those simpler substances, your nutrients, and it's going to return them back to the soil. Now, your decomposers are essential to the ecosystem because they are what gets rid of the dead bodies of plants and animals all over this earth. If we didn't have decomposers, we'd be left with lots of dead bodies everywhere. Now, that's important, but even more important, those decomposers are returning nutrients like nitrogen and carbon back to the soil, and plants, new plants as they're growing, will then use this nitrogen and use this carbon to grow. And then, of course, these plants start the food chain all over again because those plants will get eaten and they'll pass the nitrogen on, the carbon on, and eventually the last thing that eats will die and the nutrients go back into the soil again. So when we talk about nutrients, it is a cycle. A cycle is something that goes around continuously over and over and over. Here are some examples of your decomposers. In the left picture, we have mushrooms. In the right picture, I think we can see a little bit of an earthworm up in the corner, and then off to the right side of the picture, we see a millipede. We have bacteria, which is in the red picture there. So these are all examples of things that break down dead stuff for us. Now, earlier on the slide, when we talked about the levels of consumers, I talked about the food chain that was at the bottom of the slide. Now, the food chain is going to represent how food and energy are transferred through our environment. So we're always going to start with a producer because a producer gets that energy directly from the sun through photosynthesis. So once that producer absorbs that sunlight, that sun's energy, and turns it into a food source, the second thing in the food chain will then be a primary consumer. It will either be an omnivore, something that eats both plants and animals, or it can be an herbivore, like the rabbit in the first food chain we looked at. The rabbit is an animal that eats only plants. If you have a third or fourth animal, or second or third animal, so you would have a third or fourth link, those are either going to be carnivores or omnivores. They're going to be something that has to eat that first animal. And at the end of every food chain is going to be a decomposer. And we're going to show that how it returns nutrients to the soil by linking that decomposer back to the producer with an arrow. Now, in this class, when you make food chains for me, your food chain will need to be at least 3 links. The first must be a producer, the second must be a consumer, and the third must be a decomposer. Another thing that's going to be very important when you're making food chains in here is that your arrows point in the proper direction. They point to the thing doing the eating. Here's an example of a food chain in the ocean. Now we're going to start with diatoms. Diatoms are not plants. They're actually plant-like protists. So they're not in the plant kingdom. They're in the protist kingdom. However, they have chlorophyll and they do photosynthesis. So they make their own food. That's what makes them a producer. They get eaten, and you can tell that by the arrow pointing to the krill. So diatoms get into the belly of the krill, giving them energy. krill is like a tiny shrimp-like creature. The krill gets eaten by the squid. The squid gets eaten by the penguin. The penguin gets eaten by the leopard seal. The leopard seal gets eaten by the killer whale. And then once the killer whale dies, decomposers, like these bacteria, break down the body of the killer whale and return nutrients back into the water so that more diatoms can grow. Now, here are a couple questions about this food chain. First of all, I want to know what level consumer is the leopard seal. So take a minute, look at this food chain, and tell me what level consumer the leopard seal is. If you said 4th level, you are correct. You don't count the diatoms because they're a producer, not a consumer. So we start with the krill. Krill would be your 1st level. Squid would be your 2nd level. Penguins would be your 3rd level. And that makes the leopard seal your 4th level consumer. Now, here's another question about this food chain. Based just on this food chain, only what you see here in this picture, if all of the penguins died out, what would happen to the population of leopard seals? The correct answer is that the population of leopard seals would eventually die out because they have no more food. This is a problem with using a food chain. A food chain only shows one pathway of energy flow in our ecosystem. However, we know that that's not the whole picture in an ecosystem. We know that that leopard seal eats more things than just the penguin. So we can actually take all of the food chains in an ecosystem and we can interconnect them. And what we end up with is a big, giant, tangled mess that we call a food web. But this food web is important, and this is going to be an answer to a question on your quiz. The question that I'm going to ask you is, what is better to show the survival of a community? Is it a food chain or a food web? The answer would be a food web. You're also going to have to tell me why. The why is because the food web shows more food choices that are available to all the organisms in the ecosystem. So think of it this way. In a food chain might be telling me that the only place I can buy French fries is McDonald's. And that's the only thing on the menu is French fries at McDonald's. And I go into McDonald's to order French fries, and they have run out. So there's no more French fries for Miss Ennis. The bad thing is if this was just a food chain, if that's all our ecosystem existed off of, that would mean there's no food for me, and I would eventually die. But we know that's not the right thing. It's more like going to Golden Corral, where it's an all-you-can-eat buffet. It's okay if somebody took the last French fries, because there's other things on the buffet to pick. So when we use the food web, it's like showing that all-you-can-eat buffet. You're going to see an example of a food web on the next page. Here is an example of a food web, and these are all in your notes. All these animals and all these living things, they're not all animals, but all these living things are in your notes. And what you're going to need to do is use this picture to fill in the arrows. Now, some of them are really light colored, so you might have to look. Like from diatoms, there is an arrow pointing to krill, and then from diatoms, there's an arrow pointing to tiny water animals. And what you should notice is once you put in all the arrows on your notes, it's going to look like a big mess on your note page. However, now if we look at that leopard seal, and let's say all of the penguins died out, based on this food web, our leopard seals are not going to die out now because they can also eat squid and they can also eat fish. So just losing penguins is not going to kill off the leopard seal. So again, a food web is a better way to show the survival of a community or environment because it shows more food choices that are available. We will be doing more practice with food chains and food webs in class. Now, when we look at a food chain or food web, we talk about a feeding level. A feeding level is where an organism falls in the food chain. The producer is going to be your first level. And your first level is where all your energy enters your ecosystem because your producer gets that energy directly from the sun. And then as we go down your food chain, we get to a second level and a third level and a fourth level based on what is in the food chain. Now, at each feeding level, an organism is going to use up the energy it gets from eating. So even at the producer level, the producer absorbs all this energy from the sun, but when something comes along, so let's say your producer is grass and a bunny rabbit comes to eat that grass, the bunny rabbit is not getting all of the energy that the sun gave the grass because the grass has to use energy to do photosynthesis. It has to use energy to grow. So that means some of the energy it gets from the sun gets used up. And then as we go up each level, you're going to notice that there's less and less energy available because it's getting used at the lower level. This means that as we go to the top levels, there's going to be less and less energy available. Now, energy gets lost in one of three ways. First of all, not everything at that lower level gets eaten. So when a hawk swoops down and grabs that bunny rabbit, the hawk is not eating every single part of that body. It can't digest the fur. It can't digest the bones. So that right there is how some of the energy gets lost. Also, that takes into consideration number 2. Not everything that gets eaten is digested. So even though the hawk might leave the rabbit bones behind, it does sometimes swallow some of the fur, but that fur is not going to digest. So that's not going to give energy because that hawk's going to poop that out later. And the last way is that energy is always lost as heat because we use energy. So as we're sitting here today and you're writing your notes, you're using energy. You're actually getting rid of that energy in the heat source, but you're using up that energy. So let's say a lion breaks into your house while you're doing these notes and eats you. It's not going to get all the energy that you once had because you've used some of it up. And to show that loss of energy, we use an energy pyramid. So we start at the bottom with our producer because the triangle is wider, or the pyramid is wider at the base, the very bottom. So that's going to be the thing in the food chain that has the most energy available. So that's always going to be your producer because it gets its energy right from the sun. And then if we go up to the bunny level, you'll notice that the pyramid gets a little more narrow. And then the bunny gets eaten by the hawk. But again, there's not all that energy, so the part of the pyramid where the hawk is even more narrow. And then we get to the very tip, which is your decomposer, which is going to use that last little bit of energy. Now, some interesting facts. First of all, only 10% of energy that's available is going to be passed to the next level. So the grass is only going to give 10% of its energy to the bunny. The bunny is only giving 10% of its energy to the hawk. And the hawk is only giving 10% or what's left over to your bacteria. And again, the decomposers are going to use that last little bit of energy up. So, something you do need to know. Nutrients cycle. So things like nitrogen and carbon pass from the plants to the animals, and then when the animals die, the decomposer takes those and returns them back to the soil so more plants can grow. So nutrients travel in a cycle. However, if you look at our energy pyramid, once you get to the top, there's no more energy available. Energy does not recycle through our environment. Energy must constantly be added to our ecosystem by producers absorbing that sunlight for photosynthesis. Please do not forget to do the 3-question assessment following the notes.